Just 3 weeks to go before the US presidential election. The contest between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris is on a knife edge with a sharp focus on 7 key marginal states. So how will the candidates fight the final stretch of the campaign? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Tom McRae. Few US election campaigns have been as remarkable as this one. The incumbent President Joe Biden dropped out with just 4 months to go until voting day, replaced by his Vice President Kamala Harris. And that was a couple of weeks after a sniper shot at their main rival, Donald Trump, at a campaign rally. Now, if the polls are to be believed, few presidential elections have been as close as this one. Harris and Trump are neck and neck, but pollsters say the result may hinge on how voting goes in 7 states. A swing of a few thousand votes either way could influence who makes it to the White House. So what issues might decide the outcome, and what will Harris and Trump's strategies be in the final stretch? We'll be speaking to our guest shortly to find out the state of play, but first, this report from Barbara Angopa.
The race for the White House is heating up 3 weeks before the November election. Pundits say it's too close to call, and the outcome will depend on the 7 swing states. Opinion polls suggest Democratic candidate Kamala Harris has more support from voters on the issue of reproductive rights and abortion. Polls also suggest, however, that Republican candidate Donald Trump has the edge over Harris on the economy and immigration.
And we will begin the largest deportation operation in the history of the United States. We will close the border. We will stop the invasion of illegals into our country. We will defend our territory. We will not be conquered. We will not be conquered.
Harris's popularity surged initially when she replaced Joe Biden as the Democratic nominee in July. And she has a commanding lead in the amount of money raised, with $678 million, more than double the Trump campaign's $309 million.
We are nearing the home stretch. We are nearing the home stretch. Now listen, let me just say, I know we are really excited to see each other. I couldn't be more excited to see everybody here, but I'm going to tell you, it's going to be a tight race until the very end. And we are running as the underdog. So we have some hard work ahead of us, but we like hard work. Hard work is good work.
Polls also suggest some Arab and Muslim voters are prepared to vote for a third-party candidate because of Biden's stance on the war of Gaza, funding and arming the Israeli military's killing of Palestinians, and Trump's close ties with the Israeli Prime Minister.
I think that the Democrats are very much shooting themselves in the foot. And this is really established by multiple polls that shows that in Michigan, Arizona, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Georgia, in swing states, the Democratic vote is very much at risk because the Democrats have lost the Muslim American and the Arab American vote, more so in some states than others.
The election is on a knife edge, with polling averages showing that neither Trump nor Harris has a decisive lead in any state. The outcome could depend on 7 states: Nevada, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Georgia, North Carolina, and Arizona, meaning a relatively small number of voters in each of the 7 swing states could determine whether Harris or Trump becomes the next US president. Barbara Angopa, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guest now. In New York, we're joined by John Zogby, a US pollster and author of the book Beyond the Horse Race, How to Read Polls and Why We Should. In Berlin is Stephen Erlanger, the chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe for the New York Times. And in Doha is Paul Musgrave, an associate professor of government at Georgetown University in Qatar. A warm welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for being here with us on Inside Story today. John, if I can begin with you, with just over around 3 weeks to go, how would you describe the race at this point? I mean, you're on the ground there in the United States. Does it feel like the country is on edge?
It does. And the ironic thing is, in spite of all the conflict and disruption, hyperbole, misogyny, we're at equilibrium. This is kind of a Zen moment, the calm before the storm. This is a tie. There's no other way to look at it, both nationally in the polls. 2 new polls out yesterday showing it a tie. And while Donald Trump may, I'm going to put this in quotes, lead in several of the battleground states, none of those leads reaches more than 1.5 percentage points. And so we're at a tie, period.
It's as simple as that, or as complicated as that, which we'll get into shortly. Stephen, who at this point do you think is actually running the better campaign? I mean, who would you rather be, seeing that it is all tied up, going into the last 3 weeks?
Well, it's hard to say, because they're appealing to very different kinds of audiences. Trump seems to be trying to scare everyone to death, and he's doing quite a good job of that. And Kamala Harris is trying to get past the finish line without saying anything very substantive. So, one can complain about both campaigns, but they're very sophisticated and they know what they're doing. And they are aiming very, very much at these 7 states, probably actually only 5 of them. It's worth remembering, John will know this, but last time Joe Biden won by 7 million popular votes, but he actually won by 44,000 votes in key states. So it's a strange system we have, but it's the one we have. And it is really very, very hard to know what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's remarkable as things stand at this point. Paul, as we've talked about, these swing states, they're basically a toss-up at this point. I mean, pretty much all of them are within the margin of error in the vast majority of the polling that's been done recently. Can you just run us through exactly how it works for people outside of the United States that might not know why it comes down to these swing states and why both campaigns are putting so much effort into them at this point in time, Paul?
Absolutely. So it's straightforward but complicated. The straightforward part is that each state has a certain number of electoral votes that it will award when the votes are officially counted in December and then certified in January. Each state election is winner take all. So if you get 1 more vote, 10 more votes, 100 more votes in Michigan, you get all of those electoral votes for each of those. The reason we keep talking about these 7 states is because those are the 7 states that are the closest in the polls, and whoever wins, boiling it down simply, essentially 3 or 4 of those states, depending on how large each of those states is, that will determine who the next president is. And for Kamala Harris, the likeliest path to victory runs through Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. There are other potential ways, but that seems to be the likeliest right now. And that magnifies the importance of seemingly small groups in those swing states that are still up for grabs or that could turn out and decide those states' elections.
OK, John, you're the pollster here for us today. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin and Michigan, clearly vitally important, especially for Harris if she is to get to 270 electoral college votes. Does she have it within her campaign to win those 3 states?
She certainly does, and she's polling very competitively. There are some days that we're going back to the quotes here that she actually leads in those states, but she's also troubled. And as Paul points out, it is from the bottom up, some of these very small groups that are going to be decisive, not the least of which are Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, younger voters. We have a real issue going on between young women who favor Harris but may not turn out to vote in sufficient numbers versus younger men who overwhelmingly support Trump, but then again may not turn out to vote. There are a lot of moving parts here.
Stephen, in 2016, the polls had Clinton Hillary Clinton quite far ahead. They were obviously wrong. Trump won that. In 2020, they had Biden ahead, I think some of them 8% nationally, and he was double digits ahead in some of the swing states. That tightened, and Biden only managed to scrape to a win. I mean, this is pretty much a dead heat. So how much trust can we put in the polls this time around?
Well, I think the pollsters are pretty sophisticated. The problem is they are, as the cliche goes, snapshots in time. So as soon as you see them, they're already out of date. And the big question is, as John says, the undecided. So I don't know how anyone can be undecided at this stage, but apparently they are. Maybe they're undecided whether to vote or not. And then there's another factor we really haven't talked about. Your reporter interviewed Jill Stein, this third-party candidate. I mean, if she does well, she's going to give the election to Donald Trump. So it is a very complicated system, but I think the pollsters are pretty accurate. If you average the polls, it's not too bad. But again, every time you see them, they're already out of date.
Paul, Trump has outperformed the polls in pretty much every presidential race that he has run. I mean, do they undercount Trump votes? Do they not take into account that, I guess, that secret Trump voter that might not speak out so loudly when it comes to being asked publicly?
Yeah, the question of whether there's a shy Trump vote is one that pollsters spend a lot of time worrying about. But on the other hand, by this point, Trump has been on the ballot twice. There's a wealth of information about who the electorate is in 2024 that folks did not have in 2016. You know, the electorate is something that changes with each election. People turn out to vote at different rates. People end up voting. The groups of people vote at different rates for different candidates. So how they're voting, who they're voting for, whether they vote at all, that really changes. And at this point, I think we have a better handle on what's going on, but the polls are extraordinarily good at telling you if something is going to be close, a blowout, or way too close to tell. Right now, all the polls we have tell us that this is way too close to tell. And at that point, you start thinking about, well, who does have the better campaign at the ordinary, basic level of identifying their supporters and making sure they vote instead of making sure that anybody else votes. And that is, I think, one issue in which, both spontaneously, who is motivated to vote, and then who is persuaded to turn out to vote. That's something where the polls can't can't show you what the future is going to be, and we won't know until, honestly, sometime in mid-November when the votes are counted.
John, you mentioned this, I believe, in your first answer. You said misogyny is going to play a part in this. Can you explain why you think that is, that there is still an underlying element of sexism, potentially, when it comes to America and voting for a first female president?
Well, I'll tell you, we've been watching a gender gap in U.S. politics since the late 1980s. We have a gender gap now where, according to NBC's latest poll published yesterday, 30 points. On one hand, Donald Trump leading by about 15 among men, Kamala Harris leading by about 15 among women. And so essentially, these are two campaigns that are not doing all that much to get to focus right now on the middle moderate voter. They are going to their base. And for Kamala Harris, that base is young women. For Donald Trump, it's young men. Let's look at Donald Trump and J.D. Vance and the way they've been talking. Vance has talked about women as childless, cat-loving folks. Donald Trump has said to young women, or has said to young men, young women don't have to worry their pretty little heads about abortion anymore if I'm elected. They're not. Kamala's not talking to young men. Maybe she's starting this week, I understand. Donald Trump is not talking to young women. Not like that. I can assure you, not like that.
No, indeed. Stephen, you mentioned this before, the undecided voter. In your mind, you can't imagine how anyone at this stage could be undecided. But there obviously is a very, very small percentage, and that is really what the campaigns, or who the campaigns are going to be focusing on, those undecided voters in those 7 swing states. How do both campaigns actually get to them, reach out to them and trying to convince them to vote for their candidate?
Well, this is very retail politics. I mean, and part of the game is turnout. It's not just convincing them, it's getting them to vote. It's moving them, helping them, old ladies, for instance, to get to the polling stations. It's trying to ensure that the lines in the polling stations move along. I mean, a lot of it really is down to individuals. Now, you know, as Paul and John have said, there's this enormous divide in America. I mean, there's a political scientist called Liliana Mason. I would recommend her to your listeners, who's written a lot about polarization and the value disconnect between Republicans and Democrats. And Republicans tend to go for white, male, Christian men who haven't finished college. And the Democrats are largely a minority party. So it's getting people out to vote as much as it is convincing the last few people to vote. And, you know, we don't know, for instance, how big an impact Arab Americans will have, because we don't know how many of them are going to come out to vote. The big question in my mind is, will Republican women who voted for Trump in big numbers when he won because they wanted a Supreme Court that banned abortion but turned against the Republicans in the midterm elections, will they come to vote, and will they vote again for Trump, or are they so upset that they will vote for Kamala Harris for all kinds of other reasons? It's really, really, it's hard to get into people's heads, but that's what professional politicians do, and they need to make their messages pretty simple.
Paul, Stephen made the point there about Arab voters, and I mean, there is deep anger within the United States over the ongoing US support for Israel, especially now that it has ramped up its war in Lebanon. I mean, Harris and her team have been holding meetings with Arab and Muslim community leaders, especially in Michigan, which is one of the swing states that we've been talking about. I mean, how critical is that bloc of voters for her to win that state?
Well, I think that Stephen put it exactly right. We're not talking about an election of 330 million people. We're talking about many different elections in which, in a given state, a block of 10, 15, 20,000 voters, if they vote as a block, if they change their behavior, can really matter. Michigan has one of the, if not the highest concentration of Arab and Muslim voters in the United States, and it's a swing state. And we have, not just people who identify as Arab, identify as Lebanese, identify as having a connection to the Middle East. These are folks who have real, direct, ongoing contact with their families in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, who are hearing about what's happened, and they are angry. Like, they are very angry. And the spread of the war to Lebanon in particular has activated and changed how a lot of people in those communities think. This is something where people have been mobilized for months. This is something that was one of the minor factors. It ended up in pushing Joe Biden off the ticket. And it's something where the Harris campaign really faces a tough choice, because Israel remains overwhelmingly popular, I think it's fair to say, with the American electorate as a whole, but increasingly unpopular, and especially this war is increasingly unpopular with Democrats and with many but not all independents. So trying to thread the needle of her supporters who support Israel and her potential supporters who are often personally affected by these ongoing wars, and therefore are deeply angry about the Biden administration's support for Israel. It's enormously difficult, and it is something that the politics have broken out, that the Harris campaign has been more critical of Israel since the summer than the Biden campaign has been, but also far from adopting a full-throated defense of the Palestinian people and now of the people of Lebanon.
John, are those voters then going to flip to Trump, though, because he's given even more broad, widespread support to Israel and as the wars escalate. So, I mean, those voters aren't simply going to switch to him, are they?
Not necessarily. Remember, there are Arab American Republicans out there, you know, on a local and a state level, and that has always existed. But there's a decided shift this year, whereas Joe Biden could count on Arab American support, so could Barack Obama, and before that, John Kerry, because of the war in Iraq. This time around, in our polling of Arab Americans in Michigan as well as nationwide, Kamala Harris leads, but not by very much, by about 7 percentage points, which hurts. And then we do not see in our polling a strong movement towards the Green candidate, Dr. Jill Stein. She gets about 9 or 10 percentage points, which is higher than she gets really from anywhere else. But, you know, I want to debunk that myth that she is the main beneficiary of disenchantment with Kamala Harris. This is going to be a fairly tighter race among Arab Americans, which hurts the Democrat because of the history over the last 20 years of strong Democrat support in the Arab American community.
Okay, we touched on this a little bit before, Stephen, about campaigns having to get out the vote. That once you've convinced someone to vote for you, you've also got to make sure that they get to the polls and actually follow through. I mean, Kamala Harris has raised twice as much money as Trump at this point. Does she have a better chance using that money to actually get people to the polls?
Hard to, you know, it's all local, state by state, and a lot of it is just convincing people who are a little bit on the fence, or if it's rainy day, or if it's too hot, or if they need a babysitter, can you provide them? Can you bring old people to the polls?
Well, which campaign has a better ground game to do that?
Well, I don't know that, to be honest, because I'm not in these 7 key states, so I'm not sure. But one thing I think one should say is the Republican Party as a whole has been trying to repress voting for some time, because as a minority party, it's better off if fewer people vote. And it has been working to raise legal challenges to vote counting. And what worries me are endless court challenges once we all vote that will delay the result of the election, lead to a lot of insecurity, and what worries me a bit, some violence, particularly if you're having vote recounts. So this is something we haven't talked about, but I think it's part of what I look at this election. It's very polarized. We've already had some violence. We're not a peaceful country necessarily. I'm not looking for assassinations, but I can see big demonstrations in Pennsylvania at polling stations, for example, and I can see court delays that could create more problems. That's not what you asked me, but that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, no, that's because that's a really interesting point that I did want to get onto. So, Paul, if you can just pick that up, because I mean, as we've been talking about, the race is so tight, and it is probably most likely that there won't be a winner decided on the night of the election. We'll see what happened last time happen again, where it might take several days for a winner to be declared. I mean, does that mean that there is a potential for, I guess, anger to overspill and demonstrators take to the streets? And is that a real fear that Americans should have?
I think it is a real fear. You know, after January 6, 2021, the prospect of going back to an era of political violence has really reasserted itself. This is something that was not foreign to American elections in the 19th century. It was not foreign to pockets of American elections throughout the 20th century, but it's something that we haven't seen in decades. And this is kind of the bifurcated nature of talking about American politics right now, is that we're both talking about a fairly normal campaign in which I think that the Harris campaign has an edge in not just getting people to the polls, but all important these days, making sure that you get people to vote early electronically, to vote by mail, to take advantage of everything to lock that vote in. Votes are already being cast. But we also have this parallel election in which we've had 2 assassination attempts, one very close, one a little bit more distant. The Secret Service has come under fire, metaphorically, for allowing presidential candidates to come under fire literally. And more to the point, we're starting to see evidence of severe militia mobilization, far-right mobilization that mirrors what was taking place back during Trump's first term. Just today, there was a report in sorry, Steve, I can't remember if it was the New York Times or the Washington Post, about militia groups in Robertson County, North Carolina, interfering with FEMA workers trying to help folks recovering from the hurricane. It doesn't even take protests. It doesn't even take lots. If you have people walking around with automatic weapons or people intimidating voters on Election Day, that is still political violence. I'm glad you mentioned Liliana Mason, because that is where she made her name, by talking about how folks in the United States were becoming more acceptant of political violence. And we haven't seen the worst case scenario yet, but in an election that has seemed in many ways like a speed run of 1968, we are certainly seeing the potential for violence to become a factor where if we're again talking about handfuls of voters in a narrow election determining this, there are many ways to persuade people to vote. There are many ways to persuade people not to vote. And violence, unfortunately, is among the latter.
Yeah. John, we've only got a couple of minutes left, but briefly, can you just give us an idea of what you think both campaigns need to do in the last 3 weeks?
Well, they've got to go to their bases, essentially. And for Kamala Harris, that means talking about reproductive rights, climate change, and Gaza. Those are very, very important to her base of younger voters, particularly younger women voters. For Donald Trump, you're already seeing it. He's going to talk about the economy, and finally, he's going to talk about immigration more than anything else to stoke fears.
Stephen, I know you probably won't want to give a prediction about who's going to win this election because it is too tight. But do you have a prediction of what might happen over the next 3 weeks? Is there something that you are looking for?
Well, I'm looking for the Harris campaign to be a little more aggressive, to be honest. I mean, I think it's felt passive a bit from here. I mean, John's right in what they need to do. I mean, so far what she said about Gaza is pretty banal. I mean, she's kind of said Palestinians are people too, and that's gotten her some credit. But I think she could say more. It's also about what happens next. What happens next in Gaza? Who's going to run it? Who's going to reconstruct it? What's going to happen? I think that's important. And I think she has to keep pushing on reproductive rights, because I think for an awful lot of people, that matters. That matters a lot. It's about control over your own body, while Trump is pushing control over your own country. Borders, borders, borders. He's taking a page from the Brexit referendum, take back control. He's raising the prospect, he said, of invasion, of being conquered. It really is quite dark language, which, in my view, isn't matched by the extent of the problem. But there you are.
John, Stephen and Paul, thank you so much for your time and your insight into this. You, like I'm sure many people in the United States, but also around the world, will be keeping a very close eye on what happens over the next 3 weeks leading up to the election. Thank you. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Tom McRae, and the whole team, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.